Whenever South Africa hits the news, it's often about some impressive industrial achievement or new economic diversification effort. With over 60 million people, it's a country that seems to be making strides on the global stage. Yet, behind the sleek skyscrapers and the economic headlines, South Africa faces a harsh reality. South Africa is a paradox. On one hand, it's one of the most unequal countries in the world. Half of all South Africans live in poverty, economic growth is stagnating, inflation is high, and the unemployment rate is creeping towards 33%. On the other hand, it has one of the world's most progressive constitutions, with a Bill of Rights that emphasizes socio-economic rights. About 55.5% of population live below the national upper poverty line. Even more alarming, 25% experience food poverty. The situation is even starker in traditional areas. Nearly 6 out of 10 male-headed households live under the poverty line, compared to over 7 out of 10 female-headed households. In 2023, the country's GDP growth rate was 0.6%. That's a drop from the 4.9% growth we saw in 2021. While South Africa did show some signs of bouncing back, its growth still lagged behind many other sub-Saharan African countries like Rwanda and Benin. The South African government isn't ignoring this. They've made poverty alleviation a top priority, dedicating nearly 60% of their budget to social grants, and they've more than doubled spending on social wages over the past decade. But to really get a handle on the situation, we need to ask, how much poverty is left in South Africa? Why is it still such a struggle? And how did South Africa get here in the first place? To get to the heart of South Africa's present poverty and inequality, let's rewind and explore how it all started. It's tempting to blame everything on apartheid, and there's a lot of truth to that. Apartheid refers to a system of legalized racial segregation and discrimination, where one racial group is systematically deprived of political and civil rights. During colonial rule and apartheid, the majority of South Africans had their opportunities severely restricted. In 1913, the South African Parliament passed the Natives' Land Act. This law restricted land ownership for Africans to just 8% of the country's total land area. Fast forward to the early 1990s, and you'll find that less than 70,000 white farmers owned about 85% of the agricultural land. Some land reforms have been attempted since then, but the results have been pretty disappointing. Imagine living under colonial rule and apartheid. Opportunities were scarce, land was taken, education was poor, and getting a decent job was nearly impossible. Now, here's where it gets even more complicated. You might think that the end of apartheid would have reduced inequality, but that's not what happened. After the first democratic elections in 1994, inequality actually increased. According to the World Inequality Database, the top 10% of earners saw their share of income rise from 47% in 1994 to 65% in 2017. Meanwhile, the poorest half saw their share drop from 13% to just 6%. This means the income gap between the top 10% and the bottom 50% grew from less than 4 times to 10 times in just 2 decades. And it's not just South Africa. Many countries in southern Africa like Namibia, Mozambique, Botswana, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Eswatini, and Angola also have extreme income disparities. In these countries, the top 10% earn around 60% of the national income, while the poorest half earn only 6 to 9%. In 2013, experts at a Cape Town conference decided to focus on inequality, thinking that while South Africa was making progress in reducing poverty, inequality was still a major issue. But statistics reveal a troubling poverty trend. Since 2011, poverty has started to rise again, marking the first increase in the post-apartheid era. The next thing was to sit down and actually measure this menace. Poverty is one of those things that's surprisingly tricky to pin down. It's the first real challenge for any government trying to tackle it. Sure, it's easier to boil poverty down to a few simple numbers, but given South Africa's complex history, we need to dig deeper to truly understand it. So, what comes to mind when you think about poverty? Most people think about money. If someone earns less than a certain amount, they're considered poor. But that's just one part of the story. This broader perspective is called multidimensional poverty. It's not just about money, it's about everything that makes up a person's quality of life. Imagine 4 key areas: health, education, living standards, and economic activity. Each of these areas is assessed with different indicators. For example, health might be measured by child mortality and nutrition, while education could be assessed by years of schooling and school attendance. Living standards might look at things like electricity, drinking water, and sanitation, and economic activity could include employment status and assets. So, how does it work? Each household is scored based on these indicators. If the score hits 33.3% or more, that household is considered multidimensionally poor. This approach gives us a richer, more nuanced picture of poverty. In a 2016 community survey, the average intensity of poverty experienced by multidimensionally poor people in South Africa's 9 provinces ranged from 40.1% in the Western Cape to 44.1% in Gauteng. It shows us that poverty isn't just about low income, it's about the quality of life and access to essential services. But how has this situation evolved in recent years? The end of apartheid in the early 1990s and the first democratic elections in 1994 brought South Africa into a thrilling new political era. But while the world watched Nelson Mandela's historic rise to the presidency, the country was still grappling with vast inequalities and deep-rooted poverty. So what's changed since then? Well, South Africa has made some impressive strides in tackling poverty. One of the big game changers has been the introduction of social grants and a highly redistributive fiscal policy. These grants support caregivers of children under 18, people with disabilities, and pensioners. According to a 2014 World Bank report, 70% of social grant spending and over half of the spending on education and health go to the poorest half of the population. These efforts have lifted the incomes of about 3.6 million South Africans above the $2.50 per day threshold, cutting the rate of extreme poverty in half from the end of apartheid to 2011. But let's take a closer look. While there's consensus that money-metric poverty has declined, thanks largely to state support like social grants, progress has stalled in recent years. A 2017 report by Statistics South Africa showed that despite a decline in poverty between 2006 and 2011, poverty levels had risen again by 2015. In 2011, 53.2% of South Africans were living in poverty. By 2015, this number increased, and over half of the population, around 30.4 million people, were living in poverty. As of 2023, around 18.2 million South Africans are living in extreme poverty, trying to get by on less than $1.90 a day. Sadly, this is 162,859 more people than in 2022, and it doesn't stop there. The numbers are only expected to rise. By 2030, over 19.1 million people in South Africa might be living on just $1.90 a day. And who's feeling this the most? Young people. Around 63.7% of citizens under 17 and 58.6% of 18 to 24-year-old live in poverty, compared to 40.4% of 45 to 54-year-old. That's a staggering difference, though it's still an improvement from 2006, when 66.5% of South Africans were below the upper bound poverty line. The upper poverty line helps us understand what it really takes to get by. It starts with the food poverty line, which is the bare minimum needed for basic nutrition. But life isn't just about food, so it includes the average spending on essentials like housing, clothing, healthcare, and education. Basically, it's the total income needed to cover both food and other basic needs. This way, we get a fuller picture of what poverty really looks like. In 2023, the domestic poverty line in South Africa was set at 1,058 South African rands per month, which is about $55.20. Now, let's talk about something hard to ignore: the racial divide in poverty. Even after the fall of apartheid, the scars remain. In 2015, only 4.1% of white South Africans were considered poor, compared to 20.5% of Asians, Indians, 56.8% of coloreds, and a shocking 70.75% of black South Africans. This stark difference is a sobering reminder of the long-lasting impact of apartheid policies. Imagine a race where most of the runners are sprinting ahead, but one runner is lagging far behind. That runner is South Africa. So, how does this lag manifest in numbers? From 2010 to 2016, developing countries were on fire with an average growth rate of 5.4% per year. South Africa, meanwhile, was crawling along at 2.1% per year. In 2019, it wasn't much better, with South Africa expected to grow at just 0.3%, while other developing countries aimed for 4.7%. Now, like we always say, GDP isn't perfect. It doesn't capture everything about a country's well-being. Sure, it's a handy tool for measuring economic performance, but it doesn't tell the whole story. Despite its flaws, GDP is still useful for seeing how South Africa stacks up globally. Let's zoom in a bit with per capita income. This tells us how much income, on average, each person in the country makes. Unfortunately, the trend here isn't positive either. From 2019 to 2020, per capita income started to decline. This drop means people are feeling the pinch in their wallets, which affects their day-to-day lives. The slowdown in growth has a domino effect on tax revenue. Slower economic growth means less tax revenue, and that's a big deal for South Africa's redistributive fiscal policy. This policy is supposed to help balance the scales by funding social services. But if the tax revenue isn't there, the government struggles to provide these essential services. For example, in 2017 to 2018, the South African Revenue Service was expected to miss its tax revenue target by up to 50 billion rand, which is approximately $2.8 billion. This shortfall would push the budget deficit higher than the projected 3.4% of GDP, meaning even less money for social programs and infrastructure. Now layer on the issue of corruption, and the picture becomes even bleaker. It's nearly impossible to discuss poverty in South Africa without bringing up corruption. In 2023, South Africa scored 41 out of 100 on Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index. For perspective, the index ranks 180 countries in the world by the perceived public sector corruption levels. A score of 0 means highly corrupt, and 100 means very clean. So, what does it mean for South Africa? South Africa is part of the 2/3 of the 180 countries that scored below 50, which is a strong indication that corruption is a serious issue. So, why does this matter? When public funds intended for essential services, like social grants, healthcare, and education, are misused or siphoned off due to corruption, it hits the poorest people the hardest. Think about it. If the budget for healthcare is stolen or mismanaged, hospitals can't provide the care people need. If education funds are diverted, schools struggle to offer quality education. The statistics are telling. For instance, as of 2023, around 18.2 million South Africans live on less than $1.90 a day. This situation has worsened over the years, partly because of the corruption that diverts money away from vital services. So, what does all this number talk mean for the average Joe or Jane in South Africa? Slower growth and a shrinking per capita income translate to fewer job opportunities and lower wages. Combine that with a tighter budget, and the government has less cash to help those in need. But here's a question for you. Why do governments even bother addressing poverty and inequality? Government in South Africa are doing their best to tackle poverty with relief assistance and social grants. In 2019, almost 18 million South Africans benefited from state support, with KwaZulu-Natal leading the way, where over 4.1 million people received help. It's nice to think that governments want to alleviate poverty because it's morally right. People suffering from hunger, poor living conditions, and untreated health issues are undoubtedly tragic. But there's more to it than just compassion. Governments have broader goals and face several challenges that influence their efforts. One of the main issues is that many governments lack the political power to make significant changes. Tackling poverty and inequality requires more than just good intentions. It demands robust policies and the political will to enforce them. Often, the focus shifts to the technical aspects, measuring poverty and tracking changes over time, rather than addressing the root causes and finding practical solutions. It's easy to get caught up in numbers and statistics. While data is necessary for understanding the scope of the problem, it can sometimes lead to a kind of paralysis. Governments might spend so much time on the technicalities that they lose sight of the need for actionable change. What's needed is a fresh perspective, one that bridges the gap between the political, social, and economic dimensions of inequality. This means not just looking at who has what, but why they have it, and how power and wealth are distributed. It involves systematic research and policy dialogue that bring together the politics of inequality with the economic and social aspects. By addressing these issues, governments can create a more balanced and productive society, which benefits everyone. Before we get into the last part of the video, make sure to check out the link in the description for my best recommendation when it comes to further expanding our knowledge on a more personal scale. Now let's talk about South Africa's progress in fighting poverty and inequality. To understand this, we need to look at the South African Constitution and how it shapes socio-economic policies. This isn't just legal jargon. The Constitution has been a major guide in crafting policies and influencing court cases by civil society. So, here's a question to ponder. Does South Africa's progressive constitution help or hurt the need for fast, radical change? Take land reform, for example. Despite years of efforts, most agricultural land is still owned by white farmers. Is this slow progress because the Constitution protected private property, or is the real issue a lack of strong government action? Addressing inequality isn't just about controlling markets or following legal rules. It's about understanding how power works in practice, how it creates barriers and perpetuates discrimination. The Constitution can guide us, but it won't make the changes on its own. There's a common saying in South Africa, it's not just about having good policies, it's about making them work. So what does this mean for tackling poverty and inequality? We need to go beyond just drafting policies and crunching numbers on inequality. Instead, we should think about how we can use political, economic, and social power to create a better society. Thanks for hanging out with us today. If you enjoyed the video, give us a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. And if you're excited to explore more about the world's economic landscapes, you won't want to miss the video on your screen right now. See you there.